Good morning. About 25 years ago, I was in seminary. I was on staff at a suburban church on the outskirts of Atlanta, and one of the things I was asked to do on staff at that church was to organize and lead a mission trip for adults to Honduras. Part of the reason for this was the Episcopal Church, what's now called the Episcopal Church's Relief and Development Fund, had begun a project of building a village. The village was to consist of 95 homes, a health clinic, and a church. And Episcopalians from all over the country were going down and doing some labor to make that happen. But part of the reason the Episcopal Church was doing that was because in 1998, Honduras was struck by Hurricane Mitch. Mitch was a Category 5 storm that slammed into Honduras, and that was devastating on its own. But even more devastating is it then stalled over the country for 5 days and just poured feet and feet of rain upon Honduras, causing massive catastrophic flooding and mudslides and all the rest. Not long after Mitch hit, and obviously completely unrelated, the country was then struck by 2 earthquakes, one a magnitude 6 and the other a magnitude 7. If Job was a country in the late 90s, it would have been Honduras. And so thus the Episcopal Church says we're going to build this little village. And so we went down. And it was great, and we had a great time together, and we ate great food, and we met great people. And the size and scope of the poverty of Honduras was overwhelming. At the time, it was the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. The average Honduran made $250 a year. And the conditions of living were just appalling and disturbing. I remember our driver on our way into the work site, this new village, took us to the riverside of the river that runs through San Pedro Sula. And next to the river was this large open space. And it was filled with like this sea of humanity that were living in these little huts that they had obviously put together with just their hands. I mean, they were parts of corrugated metal and refrigerator doors and car hoods just kind of leaned up against one another to make these little lean-tos. As we were sitting there, and our driver was telling us that during Mitch, that whole area had completely flooded, and all of those people had lost their homes, and we'll never know how many lives were lost in that area. While he was talking, children came up from that encampment and were knocking on our windows, selling us bananas that they had picked off of a tree, those children living in that village. As often happens on a work trip like this, it's not all work. You usually get a day of play, and so we took a day to explore some Mayan ruins. And so we went up to the mountains of Honduras to see a site called Copan, which was stunning. But on our way up, out of metropolitan San Pedro Sula, the lean-to huts changed from being corrugated metal and refrigerator doors to just sticks and branches. These were homes you could literally see through one wall and out the other wall. Again, we had a great time. It was good. And we were disturbed. The Bishop of Honduras came and visited us, as I'm sure he visited every group who came through to work in his diocese. And he was there to thank us and tell us a little bit about what was going on. And then there was time for some questions. And one of us asked the question that was on all of our minds. And the question was, Bishop, what gives you hope? The part of the question that was inferred but not spoken was, what gives you hope? Because we're not seeing any hope. And he was probably very used to this, used to work groups coming down and asking questions just like this. And he was a bishop, he's a professional, he had an answer. And I'll never forget his answer. He said, what gives me hope is the Gospel of Matthew does not end at the 27th chapter. And then, like a good preacher, he just let that hang for a minute, while all of us were like, what's going on in the 27th chapter of Matthew? And of course, I'm the seminarian there, so everyone's like turning and looking at me like, do you know? And I'm like, I don't have the thing memorized yet. I don't know what's going on. And after he'd seen we did the mental gymnastics there, he went on to say, what gives me hope is that the gospel does not end with Jesus in the tomb. Our faith is a resurrection faith. Our faith is a faith of hope. If our faith can look death in the eye and say no, then we can look at anything in the eye and say no. We can look at anything and find hope there. I'll never forget him saying that. For 25 years, that's been rattling around in my head. And it's not all that different of an answer than we find in our lessons from Lamentations this morning. This is a unique day in the 3-year lectionary cycle of lessons that are provided for us. Our first lesson, the Old Testament lesson, is from the first chapter of Lamentations. Our psalm was not taken from the book of Psalms, it was taken from the 3rd chapter of the book of Lamentations. So we have this little deep dive into Lamentations. Some of you may be listening to the podcast where we just did an episode a few weeks ago on Lamentations, and if so, you can do your grocery list for a few minutes while I explain to everybody else what Lamentations is. You might remember that in 586 BC, Babylonian army comes in and utterly destroys Jerusalem. Complete destruction. And a lot of the population of Jerusalem are taken off to Babylon as captives, as slaves. And in some way, the people who were hauled off as captives had it better than those who were left behind in the rubble with zero economic activity, with nothing coming up from the fields. If you read the first couple chapters of Lamentations, it is howl after howl of people in deep pain because of the famine. And they are hungry, and their children are hungry, and the elderly are hungry. And it's a stark set of poems until you get to the middle of the 3rd chapter, which is where our psalm portion comes from today, where there is a but. And it's a big but. It's the but that is like, you were laughing over there. Okay, I know. It was a long weekend, I need a nap. And I could have said that a little more artfully. It's an important but. Is that better? The whole book sort of hinges on this. The author of Lamentations says, "But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies are new each morning. Great is thy faithfulness." The author of Lamentations begins this sort of talking about God and about God's steadfast love and about the mercies that come every morning. And then the author of Lamentations switches from talking about God to talking to God. Great is your faithfulness. Somehow, in the midst of this dark period where people are hungry and people are dying, in the midst of that, each morning the sun rose. And each morning they rose with the sun. And somehow they were able to see a little glimmer of hope. The author of Lamentations wasn't able to call on the Gospel of Matthew as the Bishop of Honduras had, because the Gospel of Matthew wouldn't have been written for about 700 years. But there were other parts of the scriptures that the author of Lamentations might have had in mind. The author of Lamentations might have said the book of Genesis didn't stop with a flood, but rather there was an ark. And after the rains stopped, and the sun came out, and the ark landed on dry land, and a rainbow came in the sky. There was another chapter to the story. The author of Lamentations could have said the story of the Exodus didn't end in chapter 1 with the people enslaved, but that God heard their cry, and God set them free, and they walked out of Egypt, through the Red Sea, through the wilderness, and into a promised land. In the midst of despair, in the midst of pain, we can always find God there. And with God, a little glimmer of hope. Now, I want to say two things about hope. If it wasn't the day after the fair, I might say four things about hope, but we all need a nap. So I'm just going to say two things. The first thing about hope, this kind of hope, the hope that we have in God, is it's not just pie in the sky waiting for God to do something. We don't just sit back and just wait for a miracle. That is not what Noah did, right? Noah built an ark. Noah did not just sit back and wait for an ark to fall out of the sky. The book of Genesis, interestingly, does not tell us how long it took Noah to build that ark, but there is an ancient Jewish tradition that says that it took Noah 120 years to build that ark. Now, the book of Genesis also says he lived 600 years, so you can do some of the math there. But the point is that ancient Jewish tradition saw Noah get up every day for 120 years with a hammer in his hand to put that ark together. He was not just waiting for God to provide an ark. He built an ark with his trust in God. The people of Israel enslaved in Egypt did not just sit back and wait for them to be, magically transported somewhere else, but they walked for 40 years, step by step. Hope does not always just come magically and from the heavens, but it comes from our trust and our willingness to work with God. If you want hope into the world, work to put hope into the world. For God, with God, and with trust in God. The other thing I want to say about hope is that sometimes when we really hope for things in God, and I'm talking about the things that affect us personally, things that are super scary, the things that we watch on the news, situations that just seem utterly impossible, and how is this going to be fixed? Hope begins to be this thing that we think of as like this tectonic shift has to come in, or this pyrotechnic display is going to drop from the sky. But the author of Lamentations says it's morning by morning. We aren't just waiting for bolts of lightning, but we are looking, we are watching, we're waiting, we're willing to watch the sun rise and see God's hope and presence there. It's not just in the fantastical, but it's in the ordinary, the everyday, because God is there too. When we worked in Honduras building this village, most of us were working on the church that was going to be for this little community, and the bus dropped us off each morning at one side of the village, and we had to walk through the village to get to the site where the church was. And we walked down this street lined with homes, and some of those homes had been finished, and they had been finished for some time because they were occupied. And the people who had occupied them, and these were humble homes. They weren't bits of corrugated metal leaned up against other bits of corrugated metal, but they were cinder block homes with a tin roof. Simple, humble. Interestingly, the roofs were designed to fly off in a hurricane so that they wouldn't damage the actual structure and they could just go back and put on a roof. Kind of interesting, but humble homes. And when the people moved into them, they painted them the most beautiful colors. They were reds and yellows and oranges and greens and blues, and some of them had window boxes with flowers spilling out of them, and some had done some landscaping in front. They were beautiful. And you saw that people had pride in them. There was an aspect of that trip where we felt like we were just putting the tiniest little Band-Aid on the biggest of problems. But the people who lived in those little Band-Aids were beautiful, and their lives were beautiful, and their home was beautiful, and their hope was beautiful. Amen.